Hi, Lena. Hi, Jim. So nice to see everyone today. I don't know if you've been outside, but it is gorgeous. So it's a great way to start Friday, and starting it with you too is also a pleasure. So I just want to welcome everyone. I'm Jamie Seward, Associate Director of Affinity Engagement Programs with the Office of Alumni Relations. I'm here with our special guest, who is also an alumna, Layna Dennis. She is a geospatial data, GIS, and maps librarian with the Sheridan Library's data services. Now, before I turn the program over to Jim Williams, president of the Friends of the Libraries, I encourage you to ask questions by typing them in the Zoom Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time to answer your questions at the end of the program. Now, I have the pleasure of turning the program over to Mr. Williams.
Hello, I am Jim Williams, president of the Friends of the Johns Hopkins Sheridan Libraries. On behalf of the Friends, I am delighted to welcome you to today's Lunch with the Libraries and Museums talk. We are grateful to Jamie and our co-sponsors, the Johns Hopkins Alumni Arts, Entertainment, Media, and Entrepreneurship Affinity Group, for helping us to present this speaker series and to highlight the vital role of the Sheridan Libraries and University Museums in supporting Hopkins faculty and students. Today's program also highlights the philanthropic impact of our generous community of friends. Many of the historic maps that you will see today were gifts to the libraries. In fact, several from our recently acquired Willard Hackerman collection. They also were able to be processed, conserved, and digitized thanks to donor support. Thank you, Nancy Hackerman. As a result, we are able to share them for study and enjoyment for generations to come. If you are already a friend of the Johns Hopkins University Libraries, thank you for making this important work possible. If you haven't yet become a friend, please consider doing so by making a gift of $75 or more at library.jhu.edu. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker. Layna Dennis. She is a graduate of the Johns Hopkins class of 2011 and a longtime friend of the libraries. Lena is the Geospatial Data, GIS, and Maps Librarian of the Sheridan Libraries. As part of the Data Services Unit, she provides services and sources that enable faculty and students to discover, explore, visualize, and curate geospatial information. She holds an MS in Library and Information Science from Simmons University, an MA in History of Arts from Courtauld Institute of Art, and a BA in Anthropology and History of Art from Johns Hopkins University. Lena is clearly an accomplished scholar. She is also a lovely young lady, probably a reflection of her wonderful parents, Deborah and Andre, who have been long-term friends of the libraries as well. So now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Layna Dennis.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. If you're also on the East Coast, I'm going to share my screen as I start to talk to you. So hopefully you're all seeing something that says the foundation and the gateway, and I trust the panelists will chime in if there are any issues with my sound or my video. So as I was so kindly introduced just now, I am Layna Dennis, and I am the Geospatial Data, GIS, and Maps Librarian in the Data Services Department of the Sheridan Libraries. And today I'm going to be speaking about maps in our collection that show the history and development of Baltimore. It is definitely not a comprehensive tour of Baltimore's history. It's only a small number of maps, but I hope it will give you an overview of some particularly interesting growth points for the city and the region. And I always like to begin any talk I give about maps with the crucial point that maps are not neutral materials. They are by their very definition a biased view of the world because they're a two-dimensional abstraction of three-dimensional space and time. No map can capture everything, and even when they're trying to be objective, which is not a given because of maps' long use for military and imperial purposes, maps will leave out details and distort the ones that they do include. So with that in mind, I hope you'll see today not only what maps of Baltimore show you explicitly, but also what they imply and what they hide. I've chosen to discuss this according to the framework of the foundation and the gateway, which I'll explain in a bit. And I also want to note that I'm going to give you the link to this presentation that I'm showing you now when I'm done, so that you can refer back to the image and links if you would like to spend more time on any of them than I'm able to do with you now. So the first order of business is that I would like to do a land acknowledgement before we get any further. I am a white settler descendant whose family has been in North America since the 17th century, but there were already people here for thousands of years whose land they encroached upon. And I'm speaking to you today from my home in Baltimore City, which lies on the ancestral homeland of numerous nations from whom this land was taken, sometimes by treaty, but more often by financial pressure and illegal treaty violations. These nations, which are shown on this map, were the Susquehannock people, you can see up here in this block, and also the Nanticoke people here on the coast, mainly in what is now Delaware, and the Piscataway people in this region, whose name is usually anglicized as Piscataway. You can see the bounds of their territory here thanks to a really amazing resource run out of Canada called Native Land Digital. And I highly encourage you to visit their site, which again, I have linked here so you can do that after this presentation. I highly encourage you to visit their site and see who once lived and still lives in your area. One of their many great features is that you can use their API to embed a map on your own site that only covers the coordinates you specify, which is exactly what I've done here, using Baltimore's coordinates as the centroid. If I had embedded a full North America map here, this would be absolutely covered in overlapping polygons and not just these ones that you see in this region. If you've never heard a land acknowledgement before, you'd like to learn more, I've also linked a very eloquent land acknowledgement statement here that was written by the Association of Research Libraries. It's actually specific to Washington, D.C., so it even mentions some of the same nations that I've named that overlap in this region, as well as others along the Potomac River and further south into Virginia. And we will return to the indigenous inhabitants of this land in a few moments, but first I'm going to back up and tell you more about the map collection. So here I have linked our LibGuide, which tells you a bit about the history of the map collection and our collecting strengths. It is Maryland in general, but as you might imagine, especially Baltimore. And as was referred to in the introduction, I am in the data services department. It's where my position is housed and it's where the map collection is housed. And we are part of we're on A level in normal non-pandemic times, although we're all working remotely now, but we're located on A level of MSC Library. And the maps came to be as they are now because of earlier collecting practices, many of which came actually from government repository practices. So the map collection used to be more integrated into the government publications, which are still very much a part of the library. This was a common thing where university libraries, big research libraries in particular, had a status where they would receive government deposits in the mid 20th century. This was kind of a post-World War II innovation that meant that many major map libraries around the country were built often with the basis of federal maps and state maps. And so this was certainly true for us at Johns Hopkins. We received many government deposits between the 1960s and 1980s in particular. And also we've had, as was mentioned by Jim, we've had on top of that, some really incredible gifts, amazing gifts from some very generous private donors. And one that has come up already and will come up again is the incredible gift of historical maps and prints from Lillian P. and Willard Hackerman. The Hackerman family kindly donated dozens of incomparable maps and prints to our collection in 2017. I actually linked a little, these links are all live if you're looking at this presentation later. So there's some information about that here. But this was a gift given to us in 2017. And honestly, there's some of the most beautiful and interesting maps that you'll see anywhere. And fortunately, as mentioned, their gift included digitization for these materials, so they can be consulted in J Scholarship. And because of that, you're going to see many of them in this presentation. And J Scholarship is the open access repository for our digital images. Again, you can get it from anywhere and it's open access, so it's open use, but also our maps are discoverable in the library catalog, which is called Catalyst and is referred to on this page. So we will be getting to these incredible maps from the map collection, but before we do that, I want to orient you with one more map that I've made myself. And this is to show using some data layers that we have in data services. One of the many wonderful perks of working in data services is that I have a lot of fun tools and toys to play with. And one of them is really great map layers. So I've created this geological layer using some USGS information. And this gives you the geology of Maryland. I've also included this little image that breaks down from the Maryland Geological Survey what the different geological regions of Maryland are. So you can see that there is a huge variety for a state of this size. And of course, it's a very funny shape because of the southern border being the Potomac River, which we'll come back to. But the Atlantic Coastal Plain, which includes us, and although we're really right on the edge with the fall line, this is the Atlantic Seaboard fall line, basically where Baltimore sits. You can also see it delineated on the geological layer by this dark green line that cuts the very shallow, flat coastal plain of Maryland, of the Eastern Shore, of Virginia, North Carolina, but up also into New Jersey and New York, going up the Eastern Seaboard, essentially. Cuts this off from the Piedmont region and from the mountainous regions that we have to the west, the Alleghenies and the Appalachians more generally. Another thing too that's so important about this region is the riverways. So you see a few, again, including the Potomac and several of the other rivers that are really famous, the Patapsco, on which Baltimore sits. But then you can also see with this really deep indentation here, the mighty Susquehanna, as it is called, one of the most ancient rivers on earth, so prominent, again, that you can see it in the topographic map. And its drowned river valley created none other than the Chesapeake Bay. So what you hopefully get from this is that there's access to a ton of farmland, but also a lot of water power that makes mills and factories possible and their transportation. And so where Baltimore fits in, there's the really fun part if this loads correctly, because you can tilt these data layers when you create them in this tool that I used, is where Baltimore fits into that is that it is really important for location. So it's within this wider location that's really interesting and really important. And also the area that became Baltimore is very well located to take advantage of it. So these data layers that I've included here, this was the original topographic layer, and this happens sometimes with web-based platforms. Retiling on map layers is very common. So that will eventually resolve, but maybe not before I'm done with it. So if you have that happen to you later, if you play with this, just sit back and relax and wait for it to resolve. But essentially, you can see here, I've put several more data layers. So these are port layers here. These are specifically icons for roll-off, roll-on ports, which are the most specialized kind of massive cargo ports that you can get on the Eastern Seaboard and other places as well. But if you look at this, so these roll-on, roll-off facilities are well suited here because Baltimore's harbor is very, very deep, and it is also the furthest western port on the Eastern Seaboard. It is so far inland to make it the westernmost port, which connects it very well to farmland, as I briefly mentioned before, especially once the railroads came. So that's what these black lines are, is I've also overlaid a railroad layer, so you can see just how they just spike off into the countryside. And you can also see the vegetation and ground cover variety in all the pretty colors I've got here. So this is a vegetation, it's a forestry data layer that I've added. It uses color to show the variety of things like the deep pine forest and the Allegheny Mountains, but also contrasting with the marshy vegetation of the shoreline, and then all of this lovely flat land in the middle for the farmland that made this region really rich. You can see, you can drag it along and play with that if you like. So now that you have that background, let's get on to the maps that you've come here to see. And this is also the first Heckman map, gift map in the presentation, the John Smith Virginia map of 1612, the first quote unquote detailed map. And now, first of all, you might say, well, look, I came for maps of Maryland and this says Virginia. Well, yes, so Maryland doesn't exist yet. That's 20 years away from the point of this publication, but you can see the patterns that determine Maryland's existence already coming into play here. It's also worth noting that along with the wide ranges in forestry and the changes, there were very different animals as well as really different land at this point, which affected the hunting a lot, not only for the nations that lived here before, but also for the European nations that came later. There were bison present in the Powhatan territory of Virginia and bison within 100 miles of Baltimore until the 19th century. Actually, that's not true, until a little bit before then, but into settled time by Europeans, there were bison in this region. So that just shows you how different this land was and how much it's been changed over time. So, and you know, the first features that probably pop out at you looking at this map are the Powhatan and the Susquehannock people. They are engraved in England by William Hull. These are not drawings that John Smith made, and they are based on engravings by the publisher Theodore de Brie, who is not someone who had ever actually seen a Native American. He was an important Flemish cartographer who published lots of images of Native Americans of North and South America, despite never seeing a single one. And he's using artistic motifs from Brazil that are not accurate for North American tribes, and they're not that accurate for Brazil either, in fact. So I've included some examples of some of his other engravings and other images that would have influenced this one. And again, they have nothing to do with colonial Virginia. These are artistic motifs that are making their way around the world at this time. But coming back to, and they also, it's worth noting these feather headdresses, they become really popular, but these are a Tupinambá feature of the Tupinambá people of Brazil. So this is also something that is not specific to the Powhatan tribe, even though you see this in the image. And also the Susquehannock stance here of this is described a giant Susquehannock person. This is a pose, and the design of the kind of sinews of the muscles and everything. This is a very mannerist European representation for what people look like. This is very much a type. This is not meant to be a realistic portrait. Not that it didn't sell very well anyway, of course, which was the whole reason to use these artistic representations. And a note about these people. So the Powhatan Confederacy and the Piscataway people I mentioned earlier, who are not shown here, but they are actually on the map in this region here along the Potomac River. So these are also interrelated with the Nanticoke people I mentioned earlier, living in what's now Delaware. These are people who speak an Algonquian language, and they're traditionally farmers living along waterways. And if, like me, you grew up with the Disney Pocahontas film, the naming is a bit confusing here because Powhatan was a chiefly title, sort of like Pharaoh, that was also used to name the individual, but could also refer to this entire suzerainty of tribes that lived along the rivers of Virginia at this time, and notably still do today. Now, the Susquehannock people to the north, also called the Conestoga, spoke an Iroquoian language, and they were hunters, much more big game, wide-ranging hunters. Their territory ranged from what's now Baltimore County well into central Pennsylvania, and they are thought to have been largely wiped out because of their history. There was susceptibility to disease and involvement in various wars during the 18th century that came from the north, but they may still have descendants in Western New York and also in Oklahoma Indian Territory. I also want to note that there is a phenomenon that was first named in 1960 as the myth of the vanishing Indian that sort of describes these people as having completely disappeared. However, the Powhatan and the Piscataway people are still very much alive and present in this region. I'm going to come back to this later, but they were erased on paper because of Jim Crow laws, which meant that they were often marked as colored on census and government records when the only distinction was colored or white. This is a part of Jim Crow that we don't often think of, but that was really devastating for the sovereignty of indigenous nations in this area. However, they've continued to live in their ancestral homelands despite the significant discrimination and all the ancestral treaties that were nullified by colonial governments. Several have recently gained state recognition. The Maryland state government recognized the Piscataway Conoy tribe in 2012, and they still live on their ancestral lands of what's now Prince George's County. And there are 8 Powhatan descended tribes that are recognized by the state of Virginia. The process of recognition started in earnest after the Loving versus Virginia decision in 1967, which overturned the Racial Integrity Act and is well known for being the act that legalized interracial marriage after a century-long ban. But it also meant that Native Americans could begin correcting their birth certificates to accurately reflect their heritage. And because of that, tribes in Virginia but elsewhere began getting recognized at least at the state level in the 1980s. Federal recognition has stalled several times in Congress for these tribes, which is not a story that I can give the space that it deserves right now. But that statement I linked earlier to the Association for Research Libraries talks about this a little bit if you would like to learn more. So all that being said, life here is kind of the blueprint for European settlements that you see later. The names of the indigenous nations along the shoreline get sparser and sparser, and the English names will increase and increase. You'll notice this in the next few maps. The shores of the bay and these dendrite-like rivers are all important, and the right to settle it will be decreed, fought for, and delineated over and over again. It's also notable, before I move on, the area that's now Baltimore, doesn't really feature in at all, and you see there's some trees. Baltimore was all forest at this point in history. It wasn't built up because it was neutral territory between the Piscataway and the Susquehannock peoples, who lived comfortably separated from each other in Maryland. And though the city wasn't a settlement point, we know that the local tribes fished in the Patapsco River, and there's archaeological evidence of habitation here that's been dated to at least 10,000 years ago. So like European settlers, the indigenous nations that lived here also migrated and built diverse societies over many centuries with social changes as time went on. And a last note that I meant to mention earlier, and I apologize, with map librarian goggles, you kind of forget to say these things, but probably the first thing you noticed when I started talking about this map and relating to north, south, et cetera, is that north is not at the top. This is a very common convention or in early maps before projections start to use north at the top more commonly. And another point about this is that this is also a very practical thing to do. If you're dealing with waterway navigation, you want to show how the ship is coming into the harbor. And so that would mean in this case that east should be at the bottom because the ships are coming from the east in order to enter the Chesapeake Bay. And entering the Chesapeake Bay along Virginia and then into Maryland is how people approach Maryland for the next couple of centuries. That really doesn't change until the railroads and then later on until flight, essentially. So the next phase of growth, and again, I've got these images. Now we're coming to what is famously called the Lord Baltimore map. This is another one of our maps that if you've seen any of them, you've probably seen this one. So John Ogleby published, it's based on an earlier 1635. And here you do see Maryland by name. It's spelled out in Latin at the top for us as Terra Mariae. I'm getting a notification that my internet connection is unstable. So the charter is given by Charles I to George Calvert, 1st Baron Baltimore in 1632. It is almost immediately transferred to his son Cecil, the 2nd Baron Baltimore, because of George's untimely death. This is referred to on the text under the family crest, along with their other province in Newfoundland called Avalon. And I think I was starting to say that Charles I grants this so he grants this province to the Calvert family because they are a Catholic family. And so this is meant to be a 12 million acre refuge for English Catholics. But conveniently, this new colony also cuts off the power of the Dutch colony of New Netherland to the north from expanding any further south. And that would definitely be a good thing for King Charles. It is named for his wife, the Catholic Queen Consort Henrietta Maria. So the first Maryland colonists arrive on what was yesterday. They arrive on the 25th of March, 1634, which is now celebrated as Maryland Day. So if you had multicolored bagels and lots of colorful orange and red foods yesterday, that's probably why, if you live here. So you can see that the first capital is on the front mouse. The first capital is here, St. Mary's City, which still exists down in St. Mary's County. And the county names relate to the Calvert family in their title. You can also see the family seal here. It probably looks familiar to you because this is the pattern that becomes part of the Maryland state flag. And another thing that's interesting is this family motto. It's in archaic Italian, fatti maschi parole femmine, manly deeds and womanly words, which is apparently a well-known phrase in 17th century England, and George Calvert picked it to be the motto for his family in 1622. It is more generally translated now as strong deeds, gentle words, and it is still in use. I researched this a little bit as I was curious, and I saw it as the title and the main point of an address from 1984 to the Society of Surgical Oncology by that society's president, and he used it to make the case for a humanitarian but bold approach to surgical intervention in cancer. And I'm not a women's studies scholar, but I do think it's very interesting to have a binary established on gendered lines with this philosophy that sounds a little bit like a precursor to the Roosevelt corollary. So anyway, moving on. Another thing that is notable here is what changed over the previous decades. You remember that the John Smith map, which now feels like I talked about it a year ago, but the John Smith map was 1612, and now we're in 1671, again, using a design from 1635. So what's changed, not only that Maryland now exists, but also that it has already had some boundary disputes and it will have more. The northern border for now is the 40th parallel. This is eventually replaced by the Mason-Dixon line after Penn gets his charter for Pennsylvania, and that causes a border inconsistency that results in war. The southern border is the length of the Potomac River, which is still true, but and you can see how it continues over essentially into the ocean. So this had already caused some issues with the Virginia colonists. There was war and also a rebellion in 1650 when Protestant Virginians took over this Catholic colony, which was later restored to the Calvert family in 1658. And the map is being published in the aftermath of that turmoil. After this maps publication, that kind of turmoil happens again in the 1680s with the Virginia Protestants taking over. And that time Catholic repression in Maryland continues until the American Revolution. There's no Delaware yet, but that gets established by bisecting the Eastern Shore a little while before the Mason-Dixon line is established also in the next century. And you can note the references they're still there, but they're much smaller to the tribes that we know were making these people very nervous. So they don't have an issue with the Piscataway, who are mentioned here through the city that now bears their name, Piscataway. And this is where they still live in Prince George's County, but it's a different story for the Susquehannocks. So the province of Maryland goes to war with the Susquehannocks in the 1640s, and the Susquehannocks defeat them, which makes an uneasy peace settle in that lasts until the Susquehannocks are all but wiped out by war and disease coming from the north. And you can almost see that here in the way they're given this kind of status, like this is, beyond this point we don't go kind of thing in this otherwise unpopulated portion of the map. And also it's worth noting the Virginia history that shows up on this map. You see Jamestown, which of course is the first permanent settlement of British North America, as built in 1607. And you also see Point Comfort, which is the site where the first African captives of British America are taken in 1619 to be enslaved. Maryland followed suit when the first African captives were brought here to St. Mary's City in 1642. And in 1664, Charles Calvert, the third Baron Baltimore, approves rule by the Assembly that establishes perpetual slavery. And thus begins the chattel slavery of the Chesapeake Bay plantations in the time period covered by this map, with consequences that the state has had to grapple with ever since. So John Smith's map is reinterpreted several times as the colonial boundaries expand. The last one widely agreed as being the 1676 map by John Speed for his Atlas of the Empire of Great Britain. It's in much the same vein as the other two maps you've seen, although of course the boundaries are changing, shifting. There's more here. Now there's South Carolina, or excuse me, now there's Carolina, there's North Carolina eventually. And one really interesting detail is that there is a Baltimore on this map, but it's in the wrong place. So this is old Baltimore, now the Aberdeen Proving Ground, and the location shifts because of the shifting manors and plantations of the old families, plus new and shifting counties. There are actually several places that use the name Baltimore, and the town that we now know as Baltimore City doesn't get established until 1729, although the port is established in 1706. Map designs take a while to change, just because, of course, printing was very different in those days and took a lot longer. So we don't see Baltimore on the Patapsco River for a couple more decades. And that brings us to what I believe is the first real appearance, although there may be people who have other opinions. So this is Thomas Kitchen's 1757 map for the London Magazine. It's the first map in our collection that shows Baltimore where we know it now. And I'm not sure if it's the first map that shows Baltimore in its correct location, but I haven't found an earlier one. So it might be, or at least it's probably based on what was the earliest. The regional boundaries and the city names are much closer to what we know today. So not only is Baltimore on the Patapsco where it should be, but also you see Delaware, and you see the state boundaries around the Chesapeake being a bit more solid now. As the port becomes significant for the geographic reasons I discussed earlier, and the city of Baltimore begins to grow haphazardly around it, mapping naturally turns to Baltimore itself, which is the next point to discuss in our map journey. So this is the first attempt to map the city of Baltimore. It's the AP Foley map of 1792. It tracks the immense post-colonial growth of Baltimore and other American cities that are now booming and under new post-revolution administration. You can note the many ships clustered around Fells Point, and some are all the way at the Inner Harbor too, which was then called the Basin. And there's also a massive woodland called Howard's Park to the north of the city. Howard's Land, which you might know from Howard Street, became today's Mount Vernon neighborhood. And you can also see the change in the seal, the state seal here, which is, it looks a lot more like Maryland's current seal. The farmer and the fisherman are the state's most glorified denizens. Next, we have Charles Varl's 1801 map. It is the second and more popular attempt to map the city of Baltimore. And you can guess just from the color alone why it would be more popular. So because of the color, it's even easier to notice the unfinished nature of the city's streets and the ghostly tracing. This is a city that rapidly expanded around a very busy port with quite a few waterways and bound by giant plantations at its northern edges. So understanding the streets and delineations are practically guesswork for Foley and for Varl. So all the yellow regions in this map are the unlabeled and unfinished areas of the city where he just really couldn't conclusively say what was there, or who lived there, etc. And it's not until the 1820s that real surveying happens. And that brings us to Poppleton's map. I apologize. This is supposed to display as a square, as you might imagine. And hopefully if you play with this later on your own browser, it will. I don't know why this is happening to me, but picture this section of the map being up here, and this section of the map being down here, and this one being over, and you get the square that looks like Baltimore as we know it today. So apologies that this is not the visualization you would hope for this really important and interesting map. But the Poppleton map is begun in the 1810s. It's published in 1822 the first time. Here it's shown corrected. He published again, and it's corrected to 1852. He was answering the city's 1811 call for a survey that was 300 feet to the inch. And this map was so useful for Baltimore that it was used with continual revisions well into the 1880s before other more conclusive surveys were done. The city has expanded north, so you can now see that there is a Mount Vernon. You'll have to take my word for it with the way this is displaying, but you can see Mount Vernon if you look at these later. And the well-known Washington Monument, which is finished in 1829, is on this map. You can also see the pattern down here in this, what is supposed to be the lower right corner of the map. You can see this image of it's a nostalgic image that says Baltimore in 1752. It's kind of a, a sort of dreamy vision of what the inner harbor looked like before it was super settled in 1752. And this image gets reprinted. It is used many times in newspapers, and we have other copies of it as it gets reprinted later on. You can also see, if you play with this map on your own and zoom in, there is a quarantine line here. That's what this little line is here. This ghostly labeling is the quarantine line that is off of Fort McHenry. This is set up after the yellow fever outbreak of the 1790s. And there's a hospital and quarantine station set up at Hawkins Point. At first it was Fairfield, but the larger ships couldn't get close enough. And these persist in some form until the city shut it down and moved medical care inland. But it really didn't fully shut down in that form until the 1970s. This was in use for a very long time. The idea of quarantining ships and quarantining goods is a very old one, of course, in world trade. So also looking at this map, again, if you can zoom in later, you may be able to see some of the detail of it. So over here, and again, you'll just have to zoom in later and take my word for it for now. This is Mount Clair Station, which shows the major cause of Baltimore's continuing expansion at this time period, which is the railroad. This is what really made Baltimore the city that it became. In the 1820s, prominent Baltimore businessmen had been researching railroads in England with the aim of what was essentially a transportation arms race. The Erie Canal had opened in 1825, and numerous other canals were following. They were all the rage, and the fear was that places that could naturally accommodate canals, including future big Great Lakes cities such as Chicago, would eclipse Baltimore and send it to financial ruin. So the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad opened at this spot in 1830, making it the oldest railroad in the United States and saving Baltimore from this fate. With its branches and subsidiaries, the railroad connected the deep port of Baltimore not only to the interior farmland of Maryland to Pennsylvania, but also to the trans-Appalachian traffic of people moving west. It made Baltimore even more of a transportation and cargo hub, but it also became a crucial part of the Union victory during the Civil War, despite the support of many Marylanders for the Confederacy. And you can also notice, if you look at this, that there are many, many wharves that are shown along, especially Fells Point. So this port area, not so much the railroads, but the port area would have made up the city as Frederick Douglass would have known it when he was here as a preteen and teenager in the 1820s. He apparently bought his copy of the Columbian Orator, which was a very influential text that taught him rhetoric and history, from a bookshop on Thames Street in Fells Point. And so I've included a quote here from his autobiography from the chapter when he describes coming to Baltimore and the opportunities that opened to him when he was taught to read while he was living here, and gave him the opportunity to see what it might be like to live as a free man. So this is a nice long quote that makes reference to places like Alexander Street where he lived, which still very much exists in Fells Point. But I'll read the latter part so you'll see where I got the idea for the talk. It is possible and even quite probable that but for the mere circumstances of being removed from that plantation to Baltimore, I should have today, instead of being here seated by my own table in the enjoyment of freedom and the happiness of home, writing this narrative, been confined in the galling chains of slavery. Going to live at Baltimore laid the foundation and opened the gateway to all my subsequent prosperity. I have ever regarded it as the first plain manifestation of that kind providence, which has ever since attended me and marked my life with so many favors. So Baltimore is becoming a very big deal to a lot of people like Douglass. It's a foundation and gateway indeed. Because of Maryland's long and complicated history with slavery, nearly half the state's population was Black. And even before the Civil War, about half of that population was free. Baltimore's growth may have had something to do with this, because since the city became rich from trade with interior farmland, where there wasn't slave labor the way the southern tobacco planter counties had, plus the growth of abolitionist Methodist preaching camps in Maryland, especially on the Eastern Shore, more and more wealthy Marylanders were manumitting the people they enslaved, usually freeing them upon death. Slavery, frankly, wasn't as profitable in Baltimore's mid-19th century economy as it had been, plus there was a growing moral objection to it. The tensions over this with the wealthy planter class would split opinion in Maryland widely over slavery and over the Civil War as a whole, so that Maryland housed many Confederate sympathizers despite being a Union state, and it paved the way for the many Confederate monuments that were built in Baltimore decades after the Civil War. So, after the Civil War, the city gained about 20,000 people. It continued to expand to accommodate all the resulting industry, which is a pattern that you can start to see here as you see these proposed outlines for the city to get bigger and bigger. German and Irish immigrants had started coming in droves around the 1840s, although there had been migrants since the beginning, including Germans who were working in the mills and on the farms southward along the rivers from Pennsylvania since colonial times. Many more Europeans come in over the course of the 19th century, so that Baltimore becomes the second biggest port of entry for immigration to the US after New York. Migration would continue to come in waves well into the 20th century, including from other parts of the country. During World War II, the population swelled with poor white Southerners moving to Baltimore for work, and many stayed to work for Bethlehem Steel after the war. In the meantime, there had long been attempts from the city to take on more land from the surrounding areas as its tax base, because these areas had remained largely in private hands and the people living there used city amenities. This map is from 1874 with this proposed addition on the edges, but Baltimore County voters rejected that expansion by referendum over and over again until 1888, and there were further land expansions in the 20th century. And as a side note, if you look at this later and you look really closely, Johns Hopkins Hospital is labeled here in its correct current location. The university and the hospital had originally been planned for Hopkins' Clifton estate, but for financial management reasons after his death, the hospital was moved to the site of a previous city hospital in East Baltimore in the 1870s. And the university, the Homewood Campus University we know, was built on the former Homewood estate in 1902, which is still private land at the point of this map. And while this is all happening, the Black community has been fighting for self-determination and full rights under the law. Adding to the population of free Blacks living here before and during the Civil War, many more come after, including as part of the Great Migration of the 20th century. The Black community in Baltimore was very influential and very educated, and during Reconstruction, many Black Baltimoreans fought discrimination successfully through legal means and community organizing. But in response, white Baltimore struck back, as did the rest of the country, with terrorist acts of intimidation and Jim Crow laws. I do not have the time or the expertise to discuss this important piece of city history, but I do have a link here that you can see later to a really amazing site that uses maps and historical documents to trace the progress of the Black community, as well as how segregation shrank where the Black community could live and work in Baltimore, and how the fight for civil rights basically never stopped. Baltimore was a segregated city well into the 20th century, to the point that Black students at Hopkins had trouble finding housing and other amenities open to them around campus, which was brought to the attention of university administration and the wider Hopkins population during the activism of the 1960s. Segregationist and white supremacist tendencies ran heavily through the city and state, leading to problems for Black workers being able to get the same jobs as their white peers, as well as housing discrimination and suffocation of the neighborhoods to which they were relegated. The closing of really important job creators in the 20th century, like Bethlehem Steel, had an outsized effect not only on skyrocketing unemployment and increased poverty, but also in hostile labor and politics disputes along racial and ethnic lines. So this leads us to a section I refer to as the closing gateway, with a really jaw-dropping quote. I think is useful for understanding this period of Baltimore's design history. So this is a reference from the Roland Park papers. We actually have this collection here at Hopkins under the map I've linked to the archives record. This quote is from the company's list of nuisances that refers to the rules for its property. The Roland Park Company, which is also written up in a Hopkins magazine article that I've linked here below as well, founded one of the very first all-white garden suburbs. It was originally planned in the 1890s on lands that had been part of the county, but again was annexed by the city in 1918. So this map that I have here is from a later development of theirs, the Homeland neighborhood. And it says in no uncertain terms up in the upper left that this land was meant to be restricted. And you can tell from the nuisances who it was meant to be restricted against. You can also note the incredible attention to detail in appearances of the houses in these neighborhoods. There's a handwritten edition here about the Japanese beetle tracking in the area, which probably refers to the type of regulation flowers that were allowed on the lawns and how important it was for them to really look their best for the people living in this neighborhood. And this is another topic that could be a whole other talk, but if you'd like to know more about the history of racist housing covenants, which while pioneered here in Baltimore became the norm all over the United States, I particularly recommend searching for the Mapping Prejudice project from the University of Minnesota, which did a comprehensive analysis of racial covenants used to make the Twin Cities predominantly white in many areas in the early 20th century. I also have below this an even more notorious and a slightly better known example of racist design. This is the 1937 Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining map, as it's commonly known. It wasn't called a redlining map, but that's what it's referred to now, 1937 map of Baltimore. They made these maps with the aim of not granting mortgages to people living in the red areas of the city, which are noted as being, in some of the documentation about these maps, they're noted as being very non-white and having too many foreigners. And this is another topic I don't have the time or expertise to discuss, but I have linked the Mapping Inequality project here below, which features work done by one of our very own professors at Hopkins, Nathan Connolly, and it tracks the history of redlining around the country. And you can read some of the documentation that I've just quoted. So lastly, on this theme of really unpleasant racist design, I want to mention something that actually wasn't meant to be exclusive. It didn't have the same exclusive kind of ideals that these other examples did. It was a well-meaning but ultimately problematic solution of housing projects. So these images that I've got here are from a redevelopment proposal that was submitted for the city in 1945 in response to the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions of Baltimore City, as people had crowded in for work in previous decades, especially during World War II, when it was really booming, like I mentioned. So the people who wanted to fix what they were now calling urban blight decided to build housing projects in former tenement areas in particular, which had the problematic effect of equating housing where non-white populations had been forcibly segregated with poverty and bad housing. So this thus further encoded discriminatory design and architecture and urban planning. And that's why, you know, to this day, if somebody says the projects, you don't picture nice housing, right? And you can see the beginning of this here with maps that essentially function as a self-fulfilling prophecy. So there's a paragraph right here that says how the principal non-white areas, unfortunately, are the same areas that are most blighted. And there are some maps referred to in this paragraph that I've also linked through the swipe feature on this slide. So if you want to play with this later, you can use the swipe arrows to look at the overlays here. So the principal blight map looks really similar to the principal non-white areas. Once again, encoding discrimination further in the name of social progress. So this brings me to the last section of my talk. I want to call this Old Foundations, New Gateways. I want to end on a note of looking to what our maps of Baltimore can accomplish for the future. They do bear witness to a complicated past full of heroics, but also grave misdeeds. And it's really interesting and important to see what they can contribute as we move on to the next phase of the city's history. There are more fascinating digital projects using maps than I can possibly count on the internet these days, which is really delightful for a map librarian. But I will close with just two examples that happen to use our maps from Geoscholarship. So first, there's this article from the Bloomberg City Lab that came out a few years ago. I've got screenshots, but also the link to the article. This describes a project to track streets across the country that are named after Martin Luther King. So you may have noticed, and this is the case in Baltimore, for example, where it's delineated here in yellow, and this is separating black and white areas of the city, the green being black and the purplish pink being predominantly white areas. So Martin Luther King Boulevard is often a name that you see on large boulevards across the country that are hard for pedestrians to cross, and they do tend to pass through areas of town so that they will bisect white and black neighborhoods. And this is a direct result of the riots after Martin Luther King's death in 1968. It was essentially the hostile actions of urban planners around the country. They used federal highway money to make it harder for Black people to organize, although they were also making it easier to get in and out of the city. And so they did provide some transportation benefits that have made them, that have made their more insidious side a little easier to cover. So this article uses, the researchers in this article keep track of the discrimination in areas that use MLK Boulevard in the name, or use names like MLK Boulevard. It's used for accountability and also suggesting public policy to ameliorate effects of racism in city planning and ways that these streets can kind of be reclaimed through various urban landscaping projects. And you'll see that one of the maps that they use to discuss this is one of our 1957 plan maps in Geoscholarship mentioned right in the article. And lest you think that I only have depressing things to tell you about, I have one last example that I really love. So this is a YouTube video from, and I've also linked his website, from Salvage Arc, which is the project of a local amateur archaeologist named Evan Woodward, who does these really great projects where he goes around and finds remnants of Baltimore's industrial past. He goes and finds things, for example, like this soda bottle from a very long time ago, and he tends to sell them and donate the profits to the Baltimore Museum of Industry and Work. And so I linked an example here that you can look at. And what's really great is I've confirmed this with him. I've talked to him about it, and he uses J scholarship maps specifically for some of his research, especially atlases that show old industrial buildings and grand homes. So that is where I want to end for today. And I know that with the delays, we've gone way over time, but I'm still happy to answer some questions as long as that is preferred to be done by our lovely panelists and any of you who have patiently waited with questions. And as I promised, there is a link down here at the bottom. You have to make sure you get this capitalization exactly right, or the link won't work. But this is a link to this presentation if you would like to look at it again and play with all of the different links that I've teased you with here.
Well, thank you so much. And we will share a link to your whole presentation in the follow-up email. I do have some questions I'd love to share. Was Fells Point a separate city at first, if you know?
I do not believe so. So Fells Point is so old as far as to how the port kind of grows up. It gets the name of, I think, one of the people who sort of staked it out. That happened a lot with Baltimore, that it was kind of these big entrepreneurial, larger than life figures would stake out various areas that then bear their name. And some of them become big plantations, some of them become these wharves, some of them become the points like Fells Point. But so that was somebody who essentially got in early with shipping. And so I don't think that it's a separate city ever, but it is, it kind of grows haphazardly into the rest of the city as Baltimore, especially with the whole naming issue, it's very fuzzy at first. And as you saw in those early maps, the city is kind of these different points that don't even necessarily connect to each other except by water, but that are considered the same part. So I don't believe it was ever a separate city.
Okay, well, thank you. So were these maps mass produced or printed in small numbers? And what publishing methods were used, if you know?
Yeah, so that certainly depends on the time period. These are all the maps that I've shown here. They're not manuscript maps. So these are mass produced. Now, mass produced, of course, in the 17th century was not what it means now. You know, mass produced in the 17th century could be 50 maps. So it just depended on the production value and all that kind of thing. These earlier maps would have been published in a lot of different places. They would have been published in these big atlases usually. A lot of old maps, including ours, are originally in atlases, even if we have them as separate sheets now. And so they would have been published usually by engraving in the case of those early maps. They are later in the 19th century, it tends to be by lithograph, and later by chromolithograph. But coloring a map is actually very expensive, and it was done by hand for a really long time, even into the time period when chromolithography was possible. Because it was such an expensive technology, it ended up still being cheaper to pay people to color by hand. And this was apparently done, I just found out yesterday from a really interesting presentation from a colleague of mine, that was done even into the 20th century. But so it would have been, usually hand coloring, and which would have been done by the publisher. It could be done by the person who got the map if they got. We do have records, some interesting records, especially in the early modern period, of people getting the black and white version, the non-color version of a map, and then kind of coloring it in how they wanted to, almost like they're doing, almost like a coloring book, essentially. But so these would have been mainly engraved before about 1800, and then mainly lithographed and often published in books, which hopefully answered the question. But yes, these are all, they're not unique, and they're still rare and interesting, but they're not unique because of the fact that they're printed maps. There are other copies of these maps. That doesn't mean that they're all the same. There are definite differences. The color could be done differently between maps, and also you saw that there were a few examples of manuscript annotations that people have put in.
Yeah, they're absolutely fascinating. Are they available for purchase, or reprints available for purchase?
We don't do that. I mean, if you go to J Scholarship, you can download these images yourself. They are, we have a whole page of legalese about, what constitutes fair use and the fact that this is an open access repository. So, certainly please don't go off and sell them somewhere or something like that. But I can link resources to that if people want to know more about how J Scholarship works. We don't have any kind of retail setup where you can buy them. But if you have the images, there's nothing stopping you from essentially doing what I'll never know if you want to kind of blow it up and print it out yourself somewhere. We certainly have. I've seen people do that numerous times. So just don't tell us about it. But no, I'm just kidding. It's fine. But yes, you can't buy them from us, but you can definitely download these and use them, for example, in a paper that you're giving or something like that.
Well, that's wonderful. So I have another question. Did Benjamin Banneker do any surveying or mapping near Baltimore?
Not that I know of. I have not seen any descriptions of him being active here in my research about some of those early maps. I could have missed it. It could be that he did, but I do not know of any examples where he would have been the one doing the surveying here. So not that I know of, I guess is the answer.
Okay, that's okay. So does the library own maps reflecting the Penn-Calvert disputes that reflected the changes in boundaries across Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania?
Yes, we do have some. Now, the interesting and difficult thing about maps, of course, is that sometimes they're very clear about this is a map about this dispute. And sometimes it's not, that's not in the title. The title will be Pennsylvania, but it'll have some little note or it'll show the boundary line, even if there's no other text about it. So sometimes finding the information in a map can be the part where you have to be really creative. We do have maps that show the dispute. I definitely, because I didn't want this talk to take 3 hours, I definitely pared down a lot to mostly focus on Baltimore itself, or, in the case of the very early maps, what preceded Baltimore. So I didn't include very much of the kind of non-Baltimore specific historic things that I talked about. But yes, we do. And I'd be happy to look into that if somebody has a research question based on that.
Fair enough. So Jim Garrett, and Jim, we're so happy you're here. He noted that he believes the area east of the Jones Falls was originally a separate town called Jonestown, and that area may have included Fells Point, which was named for William Fells. So just an interesting point from Mr. Garrett. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That is a very helpful clarification for sure. So I did say that I didn't think Fells Point was a separate city. Now the different towns and things, as far as, and that could also be kind of a misinterpretation of the question on my part, because certainly towns getting established with the very strict boundaries that they have now, that's a really recent phenomenon, as you kind of saw and heard. Places could shift boundaries a lot, especially in earlier days for this country. And so for sure, you have these different little pockets that are sort of separate. They're separate towns, so to speak. And then in Jonestown, certainly, yes, that was definitely a separate area that later becomes, integrated into what is Baltimore. But that's definitely a fair point that Jonestown may have included Fells Point, and I appreciate the clarification.
Very interesting. Another question, I think it's our last question, unless anybody else has any more, please put them in the Zoom Q&A. What is the Roosevelt corollary?
Oh yeah, so the Roosevelt corollary is the addition that Theodore Roosevelt made to the Monroe Doctrine. So this is an early I think it's 1907 or so. Maybe somebody knows who will put it in the Q&A, which is absolutely fine with me, because that's definitely not something I researched carefully. But I just vaguely remember learning from school that it's around then. So the Roosevelt corollary is speak softly and carry a big stick. So that was the point that I was trying to make, is that I think that and this is just me talking, I didn't see evidence to this, but I think it's interesting that that's kind of it's clearly a very old American idea, that your words should be soft and then your actions are what define you, and they should be very bold. And that was done, that was given in a very specific colonial context, or I should say an imperial context about Latin America.
Great. Is there a social group for people interested in maps that you know?
Yes. Yes, actually, there are quite a few. So if you're local, or if you're, I guess, regional, I should say, in the Maryland area, there is the Washington Map Society, which I could not recommend more highly. They're an absolutely wonderful group, and you can join, and they're doing everything virtually right now, but they have really great Zoom presentations from lots of very interesting qualified speakers who have a lot more formal training in map history than I do, frankly. They give really interesting, wonderful talks on pretty much a monthly basis. And so if you look them up, the Washington Map Society is great. There are map societies all over the country, though. There's one in New York, there's one in Boston, which, full disclosure, I was part of when I lived in Boston. And there are West Coast societies and a Chicago Map Society as well. So if you have trouble looking those up, you know, I can try and help you out. But there are definitely map societies. Probably there's one where you live.
Great, that's so great. Well, we're at the top of the next hour, and I really appreciate your time and your talent today. I appreciate our audience members for putting up with our technical glitch. I'm not sure what happened, but I'm so glad that you were able to find us again and join us. So I especially wanted to thank you for your time and talent and your information. We'll follow up this program with a recording of probably what is the first and the second half of the program, and a list of resources, and, you know, just share with me anything you want to share with the audience. And I do have the link to your presentation. I'll be sharing that with everybody who attended. So thank you everyone for being here. Special thanks to our speaker. Everyone, get out there if you're in Maryland and enjoy this beautiful weather. So thank you, stay safe, stay healthy, and come to more of our programs. We'd love to see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much.